what's actually going to be happening here when I'm actually doing this process? I'm going to deal with this at a fairly top level, rather than delving too deep into it. But what's happening is, if I go back to the history of programming languages, originally in the early days, you would write a program in terms of do this and do this and do this. If this, go this way, else this way. The concept of flowcharts and so on and so forth. The primary focus was on the functions that you wanted to do, the instructions, and it would be working on the data. Around 80s to 85s, we changed to what was called object-oriented. An object here is a data object, and this meant that you would have the functions more attached to the data. So if you did an addition on numbers, you add the two numbers together. If you did an addition on text, you would append one text string to another. What this meant was that we could now have a much more pictorial approach to developing software. So this is a real world, if you like, schematic of something I did with a printing whiteboard, where I was writing down the images for the structure of the system. So suddenly it's clearer that we need to develop our imaginative faculties to cope with this. And that relates to that development of imagination back into the kindergarten. It's got to start there. Another interesting point here that I found empirically is in terms of the nimble fingers, nimble minds thing. It actually helps to draw these diagrams on a big whiteboard, just like in the blackboard. It helps your thinking process when you're doing these gross motor movements. And so that's again something that relates back to, some of the thoughts from the kindergarten years. But what are we actually doing when I come up with something like this? Well, what I do is I engage in thinking as a verb, okay? I come up with fixed thought structures, what Steiner would call mental pictures. And it's these thought structures that I embed into a computer. So the computer is running a network of fixed thought structures. It is not thinking. It's not the same as our thinking. It is running a network of fixed thought structures. Hence the concept, it's quite a rule-based thing. So therefore, computers become thought mirrors, if you will. They're mirroring back the operation of that network of mental pictures. And so this is the backstory a little bit of what technology is about. It's mirroring back the actual quality, if you at one remove, of our thinking process. The better quality thinking we do, the more likely is that the network of thought structures matches the problem I'm trying to solve, and so the system works. The other way of thinking this, another going a little bit deeper here is what I have to do. I have to create a clear mental space. I have to have focused attention first. And implicit for me in this description is the link back to those, the education, the years of education in terms of developing these faculties. So this is like making a grail space, if you will. I have to make a clear space in my head and be able to hold that. I have to then imagine static structures, the static thought structures or mental pictures into that space. I then have to envision the dynamic behavior. This is really, really hard. This is why it takes a decade or so to get this done well. But this is classically what Steiner described as the Western path. It's the beginning of that concept of we work with imagination, was what he was saying. And we're dealing with non-physical constructs. The next level is inspiration. So I'm using Steiner's words here, but this is a sense of, you could also call it cognitive feeling. It's a sort of sense of rightness or wrongness about the design. Is this a good design? Does this do the job for me? And if it doesn't, then what happens here is a journeyman will generally keep on pushing and pushing and trying to stay with adding extra complex elements to the system, rather than sitting back and waiting for the ideas to mature a bit. When you do that, that's the master level. You have this concept of intuition, and you're waiting for the right idea to come. You're letting those imaginations work in you, and then from something you don't necessarily produce, comes in from left field, gives you the right idea. It's a very difficult thing to talk about unless you've experienced it. You get, what can happen is you find, oh, if I just rejig this bit here, suddenly you can get a complexity collapse. And this is one of the reasons we do this sort of work. But this point of the sense of the rightness or wrongness of something is very much an aesthetic, has an aesthetic element. It's a bit of art. And that's why I say that to get good at the technology, you have to develop that artistic perception a bit. So this for me is what I'm calling the hidden path. It's just it's embedded in the process. And most people, I think personally outside of Steiner's work, don't necessarily connect to this in this way. And if I come into some of the spiritual perspectives about this, we have to be clear. We must be clear here. We're working in a human-created subnatural realm. We've taken the materials from the earth, we've doped the silicon, we've made a world in the computers that does exactly what we tell it to do, okay? We've made, and this Steiner will call a subnatural realm, because it's not something you're finding in nature necessarily. The imaginations we're having to do with the machine behavior are non-physical, okay? We have to develop our own senses at the same time as we develop the technology. As above, so below. The deeper we go into technological work, the more we need to develop the ability to cope with not knowing, doubt. The more we need to be aware of, are we really sure about the boundary between what I know and what I don't know? Analytical thought takes you to the boundaries of what you already know. If you're going to go over that boundary into the unknown, which you will be doing with a lot of technical development, because otherwise you could get something off the shelf. You're doing something that may not have been done before in just that way. You need to develop an artistic perception, which is why I say when I'm giving the version of talk I give to programs, I'm saying, you've got to develop artistic capacities here to do the core job well, especially when you're dealing with big systems. And this, for me, it's just the beginnings. It's the first rung of the ladder of how Steiner would characterize spiritual perception, because what you're actually doing, you find, is you're learning what are the dynamic principles that underpin the world. I mean, for me, the classic one is, if you think about two cars in a junction, there's no yellow box in the middle. You can't leave you're both turning right. You can't leave the junction because the other car's in the way. The other car can't leave the junction because you're in the way. You need to know that when one car goes in, it's got to go all the way through before you allow the second one. That is an underpinning principle. In computing terms, that's called deadlock or deadly embrace. And that is what I would call an organizing principle. And we're learning to see what are these organizing principles that underpin the world. I like to go in this little section with some Steiner's penultimate leading thought published in the month that he actually died, I believe. And he was saying about, it's important for us to understand subnature for what it really is, because it makes it urgent for us to find a conscious experience of the knowledge of the spirit, wherein we will rise as high above nature as in our subnatural technical activities we sink below her. And that's important to create the strength, the inner strength to not go under. So Steiner was not one to shun the technology. He was actually wanting to really embrace that, but also add to it with these concepts of a spirit developing inner non-physical senses as a way to knowing the world. And he was saying here, we can't go back to previous civilizations. So absolutely no question of it. Okay, I'm going to stop my slides there for the time being, and just now have some reflections on how I see AI and some of the economics. I think with the artificial intelligence, it's fair to say that I think we're in the journeyman phase of playing with technology. Yeah, we're quite enamored of it. There's some very, very sloppy use of language. The person I rate in this is a gentleman called Raymond Tallis. He actually came up with a book and he's coined the phrase neuromythology. One of the primary words that he takes umbrage with is information and how information is used. In a human sense, information is always about you have someone informing someone else. In an engineering sense, information is purely about how much data can you get down a communication channel. You know, what are the characteristics of transferring data? No, without meaning. And what happens a lot of the time with a lot of the medical research in terms of consciousness studies and so on, is we use that word and we slip over the boundary between the human and the engineering world, if you will. Even if the study says we must, you know, it's quite different, later on it will be forgotten and then conclusions start to be made from that. Indeed, AI will be looking at intelligence as the capacity, the ability to perform complex tasks. It's a definition, it's a very utilitarian definition. That's fine, but it is involving a retreat from meaning. You can't deal with meaning in that area, which is fundamental to us as humans. And what I do see when I see people using chat software and so on, there's a lot of projection going on, a lot of illusion going on. People are projecting feelings and thinking onto the machine when the machine is actually just going and using a set of rules. And there's a projection the other way, a reverse projection, where we will be projecting and thinking that the human brain is like a computer, when human memory is nothing, as I said before, like computer memory. And you know, the way we handle information is not the same as computers. Machines deal a lot, because it's basically a rule set you've got there, it's dealing with the past. Whereas we, by our nature, will be looking to the future. I want to become that. So what do I need to get there? So that's my sort of take on the AI thinking. I think it doesn't mean to say it's not useful, but I think we need to be really clear about the words we use and, you know, our thinking when we're using those systems. I'd like to end on the economics and this, which connects for me to this issue of the dichotomy between the economics and the play. Why is it in this field we've got such a large development of free software? The open source software movement, you know, most of the internet's running on it, particularly when I'm at work. I'd say 80% of the systems I'm working on are using free software. It's a very big phenomenon. I think it highlights this disconnect between the money and the creativity, if you will. In a way, the way I say this is my thinking's not for sale. You actually can't pay me to think, to produce one of these systems. You can pay me to sit in front of a computer. You can pay me to have the spare time, but anything I think is inwardly driven. It's not a big manifesto about it. It's just a statement of fact. You actually can't pay me to do that. There is a disconnect. And this puts it squarely in terms of anthroposophical terms. It puts this sort of effort into the creative, spiritual, cultural space, which brings all those concepts of gift funding and so on and so forth. That's a bit of a bigger discussion, but this was a conclusion I think that Paul and I came to, which really quite surprised us, I think. But for me, this concept of it being a process that has to come from the inside out, which is what true play is, as opposed from outside in, is what gives the lie to that. And I like to really start finishing up with philosophy of freedom. In terms of, there's a quote there where he's saying that there's no external authority, good or bad, that can motivate free deeds. Otherwise, we're just a higher form of robot. And the word in German is Automat. So it was actually robot, automaton. So I hope that gives you a sense of how I'm seeing that there's this link between the underpinning ideas of that come from anthroposophy and the technical world. And it's fundamentally important for me that we develop these skills of imagination, creativity, artistic perception. It's not like it's a good to have. I consider that in terms of living in a modern society, if we're not to fall prey to illusion, it's an absolute necessity. And this ability to live with the unknowing, being open to future possibilities, whereas a lot of the education today, particularly mainstream, is dealing with the past. I think for me, that epitomizes the questions that are being raised by our use of tech and development of technology. And I'm going to leave it there. It was a really quick run through. I hope it wasn't too quick for you, but thank you for your time and attention. And then we'll open it to questions now.
It's probably that much a question. It's more a commenting. I have absolutely enjoyed this, and it's been so actually beautifully compressed because I have an engineering background, but haven't done engineering for, as it's in real serious terms, probably for 15, nearly 20 years. But all what you have talking about this idea of this artist relating to the art, developing your thinking, but also this play as an input inside out. I have just recently noticed that it just applies everywhere. I'm currently applying it purely such a discussions with a secondary school and their approach combining a special needs child's special needs. Mm-hmm. And I end up talking them, but you obviously haven't thought it through. And you have just beautifully summarized to me that what is the problem, and I'm able to use actually some of your beautifully simplified phrases to them, that where the bottleneck is, and that's what I mean, that you have managed to really compress a huge experience into this. But they are the beauty of you can apply it, the principles you highlight, really that hidden path. It's just highlighted to me. There it is. Good. That's what I need.
I'm glad about it. I would actually like to speak to that a little bit more, because one of the things I do when I'm talking to programmers is I would like to widen the vision of software development, what it means to work in this arena. It's so easy to go and see a film like The Social Network, and we just think of semi-autistic programmers and just saying, well, that's what we've got to work with. The thing from anthroposophy and Rudolf Steiner that turns that around is to say, no, can we actually work on developing skills? Obviously, for some people, it may not be possible, but can we actually widen it so you're not just having to do the technical work, you've actually got to go and see how it gets used. Because what you're doing is you constrain the freedom of the users if you don't do it well. And so there's quite a big responsibility here. And so I'm saying, I want them to go and widen the scope of what they're looking at, rather than saying, oh, being a programmer, I don't have to worry about all that. I think that's a consistent point for me.
Charles, can I ask you something? In the 3 slides that you showed about the novice, the journeyman, and the master, yes, it occurred to me that the descriptors you had on them would actually have fit more or less exactly to the medieval origins already. So, almost everything that it said there, if you assume software to be knowledge,
yes,
would have applied to a mason, say, on a cathedral building site. And I just wondered, could you say something whether you think that what we're experiencing now is an organic development of what started with early technology, or is it qualitatively different in your view?
I think, for me, I think what's happened is, it's interesting you say that, because when we haven't actually gone back, and I haven't actually intentionally hooked it into that. It's mainly been just come to me over a number of years. But I think during the medieval times, it was much easier to maintain that connection to a religious spiritual stream. Whereas now we actually have to put anything like that connection back in. For me, it's there all the time. And if you don't see it, you end up being run by forces you've got no awareness of. And that's why I consider it absolutely important to develop that, which is why I've been interested in, you know, Paul and I have been interested in this and developing it. I mean, you know, this, I hesitate to talk about some of the beings that Steiner talks about, but if you want to know what that Ahrimanic feeling feels like, go and work on getting to that panic phase and work until 3 o'clock in the morning with the coffee to keep you going. You have a concrete experience of this fear, in a sense, for me. And another element here is one of the things that I consider as a capacity that you develop over the years is the ability to hold back the outer panic and yet carry on with your focused thinking towards, you know, the goal. But yes, I think this also, we found out recently, relates to the Rosicrucian stream as well. And a fundamental point there is about the importance of the fool, if you will, the person who can say, I don't know. That's the go-to person for this sort of arena. Yet, if I'm running on a Mac here, all nice and silver, lovely, beautiful machine on the top. But underneath, you know, there's some fairly gribbly bits in the software underneath, there will be. But there's this importance of realizing that, yes, there's this outer patina, but underneath, you really don't know. And you have to say, I don't know. And that has to inform your whole approach to dealing with this. Yes, but thank you for your comment. I hadn't thought of it from that perspective, so. That was a question here from Martin Beck saying, have you been able to enter into the character, or should I say quality of silicon as a material basis for electronic? The thing I have been able to enter into is, and it's one of the original things for starting on this path. It does give rise to concerns about almost the boxed offness of your thinking that has to happen, the constraint of your thinking. You do have to constrain your thinking when dealing with computer programming down specific lines, which is why I highlight the redeeming point of that is this bit where you sit back and let the thoughts work in you and wait for an intuition, or you go and have an artistic process, which is one of the things I like to do is watercolor painting, specifically with water, you know, because it's something that leavens that whole approach of having very constrained thinking. So on the one hand, it's really good to be able to control your thinking in a way, to actually develop a disciplined inner process. But also, yeah, there are costs to that, I think. And I think we have to be careful of that. And for me, this is the thing. We need to see, oh, there's the redeeming point. We need to work with those points more. I don't know if that answers the question, really. I mean, it doesn't have to be silicon. One of the later ones is diamond. We're now able to grow diamonds purer than you can get in nature. And I believe they dope the diamond with boron. And so they're coming up with diamond substrate chips. I don't know, I haven't heard much in the last few years, but they can run hotter than silicon, so they don't melt. So they actually, I think, run about 10 times faster. So we've hit a plateau. So it's not so much for me the particular material as the way we are modifying it to create the world that does exactly what we want it to do.
Thank you. Alder Bridge School would like to thank you again.